Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Watson Michael from Ceylon Institute of English and Leadership. And today, I have a very interesting guest with me, Robert Blake, former US Ambassador to Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. Currently, he is a Senior Managing Director that leads the Southeast Asia practice at McLarty Associates and advises clients in South Asia. Also, he's in several other boards. Ambassador Bob, welcome to our show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Michael. Thank you so much for inviting me. That's quite an introduction you gave me.
It's an absolute honor. So, these days we are facing we're facing a year with climate challenge and more to come with governance changes. What are your views on that?
Well, first of all, Michael, let me just say, I'm living in the United States, but most of the rest of the world understands the threat that climate change poses to future growth and to stability, and really, therefore, the imperative of taking action on climate change. Unfortunately, our president, Donald Trump, does not agree with that. So the question is, how much of an effect does Trump's pullback on US federal action on climate change really have for the rest of the world? And I'd say the answer is not as much as you and your listeners might think. First of all, in terms of America's own climate goals, the Biden administration, as you may remember, submitted its own in what they call enhanced nationally determined contribution, which is its own climate goal, at the very end of its administration in December of last year. And it committed the United States to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by between 61 and 66% below 2005 levels by the year 2035, and also to achieve what we call net zero by 2050. So that's the gold standard that we want all countries to meet, is net zero by 2050. Now, of course, no one expects the Trump administration to implement that goal. But what's important is that there is a whole coalition out there of American states and municipalities and others. So huge states like California, New York, Washington State, and they represent collectively about 2/3 of US GDP. And all of them are fully committed to those Biden administration goals that I mentioned. So it's very important that they're going to continue to do what the Biden administration said. And I think they're actually going to continue to drive American policy. Where I think Trump's withdrawal will make a difference when he was the special climate envoy. So I had a chance to see him firsthand, and I can tell you that he and his predecessors in this special climate envoy role were a real force in global climate diplomacy because, first of all, they pressed countries to raise their ambition, but also they played a really important role in forging various coalitions to really make a difference in the climate fight. So I could mention a few. Of course, there was a big coalition on climate finance. There was another one called the First Movers Coalition, which was an effort to mobilize collective global action by companies to address emissions in what they call hard to abate sectors. Things like steel and cement, where it's really difficult to bring down those emissions. And so the idea was if you can get companies who are working in those areas to work together, then no one will lose any comparative advantage if they're all working towards that same goal. And it really did have an impact. So the question now is, of course, if the United States is no longer in the climate game, who's going to lead. And I think this year it's really going to fall to, first of all, the UN itself, which has always been an important leader,
Yeah.
and then to Brazil, because Brazil is the host of this year's climate summit. You remember last year it was in Baku in Azerbaijan. So it's really the UN and Brazil who are going to lead all of these climate diplomacy efforts. And of course, you know, the EU, Germany, Japan, and other countries will play important roles as well. And so their task collectively is not only to get countries to make new, more ambitious commitments, but also to implement their existing commitments. Because I'm sorry to say, Michael, but most of the countries are not in compliance with their own targets. So there's a lot of work to be done. And so in short, maybe in summary, in the answer to your question, you know, Trump's withdrawal matters, but not as much as you might think, but it's really important now for the rest of the world to step up.
Very true. Very true. So, there is a bit of a question. Okay, now what is the difference between global warming and climate change?
That's a great question because there's a lot of confusion about that.
Mm.
So, yeah, so global warming refers really only to the rising surface temperatures of the Earth. And global warming, as you know, has been going steadily up. Climate change is a much wider phenomenon because that includes not only global warming, but also all of the various impacts of global warming. So rising sea levels, melting glaciers, and rainstorms that we're seeing around the world, the more frequent droughts, the more fires we're seeing in places like the United States.
Yeah.
And I think an important measure for all of your listeners to understand is the level of CO2, of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's sort of the most standard measurement. And scientists say that the safe level of CO2 in the atmosphere should be about 350 parts per million. Now, where are we? We're today, if you were to look it up on Google, you would probably see that it's about 425 parts per million. So we're well above what scientists consider the safe levels. And that's, of course, why we're seeing more intense storms and rising sea levels and so forth. So that's maybe a short answer to your simple question.
Yeah, I mean, anyway, it's well articulated, okay, by you. Right. So now comes a bit of an interesting thing, okay, some data, right? So according to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific in 2023, okay, the region contributed approximately 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions of 54.5 gigaton CO2 equivalent, driven by rapid industrialization, urbanization, high dependence on fossil fuel, and deforestation. And then the region accounts for 62.4% of global fossil fuel CO2 emissions and 52.2% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. And but the average per capita the greenhouse gas emissions dropped in 2015, but it's showing gradual increase. So how important is it for the region, especially the Asia Pacific region, to decarbonize?
Hugely important is my short answer to that. As you say, Asia accounts for a bit over 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And Asia has two of the three largest emitters. China is at the top of the list, and India is the third after the United States. The United States is number two. So what China and India and the other Asian countries like Indonesia and many, many others do matters a lot to the overall effort. So let me just talk a little bit about each of those. China, first of all, China's current target is to achieve net zero emissions by 2060. So not 2050, but 2060.
Yeah.
And China is one of many countries that have missed the UN deadline this year to submit revised climate targets, revised NDCs. So, of course, the entire world is watching now to see what China's new NDC will be and whether they're going to increase their ambition before these very, very important talks in Brazil in November. Now, there are a few things for your listeners to understand. First of all, China's overall greenhouse gas emissions peaked last year. So that's good. So they're already beginning to come down a little bit. But one very complicating factor is continued coal use in China. China recently announced just this week, as a matter of fact, that they plan to continue to build coal-fired power plants through 2027. So for 2 more years still, because they say that they're needed to help meet various power demands in various parts of the region and to stabilize their grids. So on the positive side, as I'm sure you know, China is the global leader in deploying low-cost renewable energy, particularly solar, but also electric vehicles, many other technologies. So they have really done better than any other country in the world, which is really a tremendous achievement. So, you know, with the U.S. no longer in the picture in terms of climate diplomacy, China really has a huge opportunity now to show that it can step up and really lead the world. And I hope they do that. Now, turning to India, India too has made very, very impressive progress on renewable energy particularly. So they have a really ambitious target to deploy 450 gigawatts of clean energy by 2030. That's an enormous goal. And they're actually on track to meet that, which is unusual. As I say, a lot of countries make these great goals, but then they don't actually meet them. And so India, to its credit, is on track to meet that goal. But like China, they also have a lot of coal still, and coal remains a very, very important energy source for electricity. And in parts of northeastern India, coal is still one of the mainstays of the economy. So it's politically difficult for them to just dramatically reduce coal right away. So that's going to be a challenge for them. So they've got to figure out how to balance those various equities. India currently has a net zero target of 2070. So again, observers are hoping that they're going to raise their ambition this year and before the meetings in Brazil. And of course, they're going to do so assuming that appropriate international financing can be mobilized. So again, the short answer to your question is Asia matters enormously to the overall climate picture. And again, we hope that particularly China and India are going to show real leadership this year.
Now, emerging markets, they are struggling with climate finance. What are your views on that?
So this is a complicated question. First of all, as you know, you're a Sri Lankan. It's important to note that developing countries have more than just climate finance to worry about. Most still have to eliminate poverty, so they have to ensure that they're allocating sufficient government funds for education, for health, for infrastructure, and all of the other priorities that are needed to reduce poverty. Secondly, many developing countries have very high debt burdens, as does Sri Lanka for that matter. And at last year's climate summit in Baku, one of the most striking things that I heard was that 34 sub-Saharan African countries spend more on debt service than they do on health and education combined. So just think about that for a minute. So that basically means that debt service is crowding out spending on health and education, never mind spending on climate finance. So,
mm,
it just underlines that these developing countries have a lot on their plates that they've got to meet. And, climate finance is not necessarily at the top of the list all the time. So that's why climate finance from other countries is that much more important. Now, another striking statistic that I read in a recent article in Foreign Affairs, great
okay.
magazine, and it was done by the very famous energy economist Dan Yergin. And Dan
Okay.
Yergin noted in his article that half of the population of the developing world, so 3 billion people, annually use less electricity per capita than the average American refrigerator. Now, that shows you the
Wow.
average American refrigerator is a pretty powerful thing, but it also
Mm,
shows you um, how poor most of these people still are, that they have
mm,
such tiny amounts of electricity that they can still access. So that also, is on the one hand a reflection of the continued poverty, but it also shows the immense opportunity that exists to
mm,
ensure that as those 3 billion people gain access to electricity, that most of that has got to be clean energy. And so that's going to be, I think, one of the most important tasks in the next 20 or 30 years. And that raises another challenge for developing countries, and that is that the cost of capital is very
mm,
high in places like sub-Saharan Africa because loans are riskier there. And so they have to rely a lot more on concessional finance. And that means concessional finance from, for example, the multilateral development banks like the World Bank. So I was
mm,
very delighted to hear last year that the World Bank and the African Development Group um, came out with an incredibly important announcement where they pledged $35 billion to provide
wow.
electricity access to 300 million Africans over the next 6 years.
Mm,
So they're going to take a giant step forward to provide electricity and hopefully clean electricity to lots of different people. So that's a really important start to this whole thing. Now, to come back to your original question, at last year's COP in Baku, countries agreed to work towards the provision of $1.3 trillion a year in
mm,
funding for developing countries by 2035.
yeah.
So again, 2035, a long way out, but still 1.3 trillion is a pretty good high number. And developed
Mm,
countries pledged that they would provide 300 billion of that per year. So that's the good news. The bad news
yeah.
is that meeting that is going to be hard. First of all,
Mm,
as we've already said, the Trump administration has already made clear that they're not going to provide any climate finance, not only in their own country, but around the world. And
mm,
so the question is, can the EU and others make up the difference? And the answer is probably not. The EU countries are going to be forced to reduce climate and development finance because President Trump
mm-hmm,
is pressuring them to increase their defense spending this year to
mm,
5% of GDP. So again, that's going to crowd out a lot of climate and development finance. Japan's growth is relatively sluggish this year. China is facing
mm,
its own economic challenges. So
yeah.
so the countries are going to be hard pressed to meet this gap. There are other sources. Private banks could
Mm-hmm,
provide up to
yeah.
probably about $500 billion a year, but even they are
Yeah.
reducing a lot of their climate targets this year. So, the banks are not going to be quite as high as we had hoped. There are other
Mm,
interesting sources. There are things, of course, the multilateral development banks that I already talked about, but also things like debt for nature swaps that are becoming more
mm,
common now. And people are beginning to think about new ideas. Um,
mm,
so, for example, if all else fails, maybe we should be considering an international tax on flights. So, if there was a
mm,
carbon tax on international transport, that could raise hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, of course, that would be unpopular, but the good news is it would tax the rich people who can already afford to get on an airplane.
mm,
And a lot of people think that that's something that is fair. So I think already now people are beginning to think about these alternative sources of climate finance. So the picture is relatively dark, but it's at times like this that people are forced to come up with new ideas and new solutions. So hopefully we'll see that at the next COP in Brazil.
Absolutely.
Sorry,
I
that was a
mean,
rather long answer to a short question, but it's
well,
complicated. I think it's important for people to know.
well, 100%. I mean, you explained it very well. Okay, so I mean, that is fantastic. Great. So, yeah. Now, I have noticed that on LinkedIn you're posting great content. Okay, fantastic content. Can you
Thank you.
tell us what you have been doing in helping with climate change?
Sure. So first of all, I think anybody who's listening to this podcast agrees that climate change is one of the most important issues of our time. And
Mm,
all of us who care about this, and hopefully that should be everyone, therefore have an obligation to do what we can. And everybody's going to
mm,
be different. So, as
sure.
US Ambassador to Indonesia, you mentioned I was in Indonesia. I worked
Mm-hmm.
with my great team from the US Agency for International Development and other experts. We had a large embassy there to develop a sustainable palm oil initiative that helped to
Wow.
substantially reduce deforestation from palm oil, which was one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Indonesia at that time. And that's made a big difference. And
Mm,
so that was one example. Like I said, I also in 22 I joined John Kerry's climate team, and he had just an amazing team of climate experts who were much more
mm,
knowledgeable than me. And I was asked because I knew the ministers in Indonesia and I had a good, relationship with them. And so we together worked with our friends from the Department of the Treasury and with our friends from Japan to help negotiate what's called a Just Energy Transition Partnership, which was a $20 billion deal
wow.
to basically provide the financial resources to help Indonesia to accelerate its decarbonization. So that was another, step that I took. And then since then, I've been doing a fair amount of public speaking around America to talk about climate diplomacy and the climate fight. And again, my main purpose is to help people understand that we are making progress and we have to sustain
Mm,
that progress because a lot of people think, oh, it's hopeless and what's the use in even
mm,
trying? And we never want to have people feel that way because we all need
sure.
to continue to work on this. And,
Mm,
I like to remind people that at the time of the famous Paris climate negotiations in 2015, where the
mm-hmm.
target was to keep global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees centigrade by
Mm,
2100, the world at that time in 2015 was on track to see warming of about 4 degrees. And
ah,
because of the progress that we've made in the last 10 years, we've actually reduced that substantially by about 1.5 degrees. Now, we're still well above the 1.5 degree target, but we've made a lot of progress since just in 10 years. So, yes, we've made progress, but we still have a lot more to do. And,
mm,
people say, well, what can I do? I'm just a simple person. Everybody can make a difference by taking a few very simple steps. One, power your home with renewable energy. I have that in my house. Two, buy an electric vehicle. I have an EV and I love it. And it of course there's no emissions of any kind because it's electric.
mm,
Three, and this is important, believe it or not, eat less
yeah.
meat so that forests are not cut in Brazil and elsewhere, and adopt a more
Sure.
plant-based diet. And by the way, that's going to also have important health benefits for you. And then the other
Yeah.
thing that I think everybody can do is reduce food waste. We in America,
Mm,
particularly, we are guilty of massive amounts of food waste.
mm,
And where does all that go? That goes into landfills. And then the organic waste, as it decomposes, it releases methane. And methane is one of the most powerful greenhouse gases. And so if we can
Mm.
reduce methane, we can make a really big difference. And so
Yeah.
we have in my neighborhood here in Maryland, we have a weekly organic waste recycling. We have a little green bucket that we put out, and somebody comes around and dumps it into a larger one, and then it gets ground up and does not go into a landfill. Instead, it becomes fertilizer or
Wow.
in several other ways. So, if you don't have that in your neighborhood, then try to make progress and ask your local leaders to set one up, because that by itself will make an enormous difference.
Absolutely. I mean, wow. So I'm understand, Bob. It's just for every question which I'm asking you, you're giving a short master class. Okay, fantastic. Great. So, what was one of the most challenging things that you faced, and how did you overcome it?
That's a great question. So I think one of the fears that we all have, and many of us don't like to admit it, is what we call imposter syndrome.
Mm, mm,
Which is basically, am I really qualified to do this? And the answer is yes, you are. Um, and, if you have imposter syndrome, it means basically it can discourage people from getting involved because they think it's too
mm.
complicated and, I'm not going to really be able to make a difference. And that's just not the right way to think about it. And, you know, we all have that. I mean, I could tell you when I
Mm.
started out my career in the State Department,
Okay.
I and everyone else at the State Department, we changed jobs every 2 to 3 years. So
Wow.
every single time you went into a new job and you were completely new at what you were doing. And, you had to learn very, very fast. So we actually got
Mm.
pretty good at getting up to speed quickly and overcoming our fear of imposter syndrome. And that helped me a lot, when I got going working on climate, because you know, when you start, you think, oh gosh, there are all these famous climate scientists
Yeah.
and atmospheric
Yeah.
scientists, and what can little old me do? Well, that's not the way to think about it. We all can make a difference, and you don't need a PhD in atmospheric science to make a difference. And I think everybody should know that the basics about climate are fairly easy to learn. The hard part is to take those first steps, get involved, and then get your neighbors involved and your friends and your family and everyone else. And if you can get that kind of collective action going, you can make a difference.
Absolutely. And yeah, just before we go to the final part, since you said about the imposter syndrome, I wanted to say I still remember that when you were the ambassador in Sri Lanka, my dad showed an article in the newspaper. Look, he's walking and going back to the embassy. He didn't want to waste time in the traffic, right? And I was like, what? For real?
That's
And
that's true.
that's, yeah, great. So, final message from you to our listeners and viewers.
Sure. So I guess my final message is every single year, global temperatures continue to increase, but
Mm,
so do the costs of inaction.
yeah.
So natural disasters and severe weather are only going to get worse. So there's no point in trying to
Mm,
deny it. Last year, natural disasters and severe weather cost the global economy more than $400 billion.
mm,
And those are going to just continue to. So the world is increasingly going to come to understand that the costs of climate adaptation and prevention are much lower than the cost of disaster recovery and spending $400 billion a year recovering from all
mm,
these disasters. Why don't we do
yeah.
a little prevention? So that's the first point. The second point is there is hope. We are making progress. We're not making it as fast as we need to, but we are making progress. And there, I think, a few signs of hope for the world. And I'll just mention a
Mm,
few. One of them
sure.
is renewable energy costs are plunging around the world. The cost of a solar panel today is roughly 1% of what it cost in 1980. So think about that. In 45 years, it's gone down, hugely. Another really important part of the electricity is that 85% of the electricity generation capacity that was added around the world 2 years ago, the most recent statistics, was powered by clean energy. So clean energy is overwhelmingly the source of new power around the world, with some exceptions. So most of the world gets it. It's just a matter of providing, again, the finance and it must be said, a lot of particularly developing countries have got to put in place the various policy changes that are going to be needed, because in many cases there are local content restrictions. They've set the prices of clean energy too low, so there's no incentive for companies to come in. Those kinds of reforms are needed. Third, I think people need to understand that technology continues to progress. 10 years ago, who would have thought that we would be talking about green hydrogen, or that we would be talking about small modular nuclear reactors that are the size of a shipping container? Those are increasingly coming in online now, I think it'll be very, very important, as is green hydrogen. And in the future, we're going to be seeing new technology like fusion probably emerging. So technology is going to continue to advance and help us. Another important fact is that private companies are getting involved. There's a wonderful global initiative called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and anybody can Google that. There are now 7,600 major companies around the world that have science-based climate targets. So they are committed to lowering their emissions, and they have gone through a pretty rigorous process to evaluate their commitments and make sure that they're real. And then they have to keep those commitments. And if they don't, they're kicked out of the initiative. So 7,600 major companies is huge. I encourage your listeners to look at that list. It's a very impressive list. Definitely. Last but not least, there are trade measures like the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And that's going to incentivize countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because the European Union is going to measure the carbon intensity of their imports from countries that have relatively high carbon intensity. And then those countries are going to be taxed accordingly. So that's going to provide quite an important incentive. Let me just end perhaps with a quote from His Holiness Pope Francis, who sadly passed away this morning. And I say that because Pope Francis was a profoundly decent man who cared about social justice, who lived his life in a very simple way. But he also was quite passionate about the importance of addressing climate change. And in an interview last year, he characterized climate change as the road to death. And he said that it is denied by what he called foolish people. And I think that's an appropriate way to end, because it really does underline that we all need to take action on climate change. And it's too late now to start denying climate change. It's there for everybody to see in the form of the storms and all of the rest that we've been talking about. So I hope that your listeners come away today with an understanding that nobody is, you don't have to be too smart to take action on climate change. There's a lot that everybody can do. And if we all do something and work together, we can really make a difference. So, Michael, again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and God bless you for thinking of this podcast.
Absolutely. It's been such an honor, Ambassador Bob. And thank you very much for coming despite having a busy schedule. And God bless you too.
Good to see you. Hope to see you soon.
Absolutely. Fantastic.